Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Clear Process Solutions web tips session. This will again be on the Precisely Automate platform. And this is the second part in our three-part series on demystifying the form process launch plugin and how to use that within Foundation and Evolve. Today, we're going to be focusing on the parameters in the form process launch node or the plugin itself and helping you understand what each of those parameters is doing or is intended to do. And we're going to take a look at that in both Foundation and the Evolve versions of the platform. So configuring the node itself can be quite overwhelming. I'm just going to switch over right now. And we're seeing here Foundation, and I think we'll just go ahead and start in Foundation. But you can see here there are quite a few parameters that we need to set within this plugin, okay? And it can be overwhelming. And there are quite a few differences between Evolve and Foundation, and those differences are largely related to the absence of SharePoint in the Evolve platform. But we're going to walk through the most common and effective ways to configure this node and get it to work. So as we discussed in part one, the form process launch can be used to launch a single process or many processes, and that will impact the way that we configure the parameters in this plugin. So let's get to it. So the first thing that happens before we even click the little ellipsis button to open the parameters here. So if I've selected my launch tile process or my form process launch, the first thing we need to do in the foundation environment is make sure that this continue without waiting option is set to false. Otherwise, what happens is the workflow just blows right past this before it's given a good opportunity to go through and launch all your processes and process all the information, right? In addition to that, there's not always enough time for everything to happen. If we have a larger form and it's, sending a lot of data to our child process, that can sometimes take a while, especially if we're launching many processes. So what we like to do as well is just put a wait plugin right after this. And again, in Foundation, you have to make sure that this wait plugin is set to false. I don't believe we need to do that anymore in Evolve. But yeah, we just got to make sure that wait plugin is set to false as far as continue without waiting. We want it to wait here. And as I mentioned, a 1 minute wait should be just fine to make that work. But when we get into the process launch plugin itself, um, we want to make sure that we walk through and explain all of these different parameters that we have to configure. So in order to explain all this in the blog as well, there's going to be some screenshots that you can take away to make sure that you can kind of see the explanation of each of the different settings here. So, one of the things that we get into trouble with is, and what people get confused on is, when I'm launching a separate solution, so I've created one solution and it's going to launch a completely different solution, or sometimes I will launch the same solution from that solution, right? So you can see here that the process name we have is called child process test, and then the form essentially is called child process test as well. A little bit redundant, but that's how it's set up in Foundation, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But you can also see here that we're launching the child process test. So this solution is launching itself in this Foundation example here, right? So um, just wanted to point that out because people often get confused about that. But to start with in Foundation, the first parameter that we see is site, and this is just the form site where both of your solutions will be found. Now, in order to launch a child process or a solution in Foundation, both of those solutions need to be found in this form site, okay? You can't have one in one form site and one in another. They both need to be in the same site. The next thing is the process name, and that's just the name of the process that you want to launch or your solution name. And pretty much the same thing goes for the form name. And then we have this new thread parameter here. And that is basically always left as no. I've not yet found a use case where setting this to yes was helpful. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't be, but for the most part, we just leave that set to no. Okay. The next thing that we'll talk about then is the swim lane, right? So this is basically saying what swim lane in the child process do you want to resolve with, and basically what we're saying is resolve with the originator, right? So whoever opened up and launched the parent request, we want to make sure that they get set in this requester swim lane that we've created, right? So again, because we're launching a child process using the same solution in this example, I'll go ahead and close the parameter window for a minute, and we'll just kind of talk about how that would work. So when I launch the parent request, I'm the originator. I will be resolved into this originator swim lane. But when the child process is launched, that originator on that child process is set to the system account or the admin account um, within your Foundation environment or your Evolve environment. And then it looks as though, a system account created that request when in reality, the originator of the parent is creating that request. So what we do is we create another swim lane. We tend to call it requester. You can call it, child originator. You can call it whatever your heart desires. But we ultimately want to have this swim lane so that we can take the originator of the parent request and resolve this swim lane um, with that user so that all the tasks that they may need to do as the originator, if something were to get rejected back in the child request, or if they have other tasks they need to do later on in the process, we can assign those tasks to them in this swim lane. If we were to put this node up here, it would get assigned to the system account, and the system account is not going to automatically do your work. Unfortunately, we're not quite at that level yet. So it's really important that we have this swim lane so that the originator can still be involved with the process. Okay, so that is going back to the parameters. That is what the swim lane parameter is for. You're basically specifying what swim lane you want to resolve to that originator. The user site is the form site where the user list can be found. That user list is typically is the list, the process list, and it, I don't know, to be honest, how it goes and gets the users from there because it's not, users aren't necessarily stored in there. This is your process list, but this is just the setting that we need to have. So we have you have to specify the user site and then where your child process is located. And then basically what we are specifying is the query that basically says, okay, all the processes that I want to launch have to be related to my parent process. So that's where we say title is equal to form ID. And that's the general setting that we typically use to get this to work. From there, we start to get into source and destination fields. So you can map a source field in your parent solution to a destination field in your child solution. Now you notice I don't have anything mapped here. And the reason for that is because the child is launching, or the parent, excuse me, is launching the child process. So I can just simply turn auto sync on, and and the fields are named the same because it's the same solution. So those values will be passed over. Now, if you have things that need to be different, for example, maybe you need somebody to actually populate that field in the child process, you'd want to set that to no so that it's not already populated. Not that it couldn't be overwritten, but we want to just make sure that whenever a field is really important, it's not typically auto-populated with something because then the user will typically scan it and skip over it and not put any thought into providing a value. Single process, that is basically asking you if you want to launch one process. So when I go to launch another process, is it a one-to-one? This process can launch one additional process, or do I want it to allow it to launch multiple processes? So basically it's asking you, do you want to launch a single process? We have this set to no so that it's allowed to launch multiple processes, okay? From there, you're going to specify, and these are a little bit out of order, unfortunately, but you're going to specify the repeating group in your form where this plugin is going to go look, and it's going to launch a new request for each row. So basically what we're saying is this repeating group is where we're going to have all the rows that we're going to use to launch all our processes. And then if there are specific fields, like individual fields in your child form that you want to fill with the column value from your parent, that's where you would map these things here. So that's what you're seeing in the rest of this mapping is I'm populating individual fields in the child process from the column associated with those values, right? So that column, the first row, the value in that column will get mapped to this individual field in my child form, and so on and so forth for all these different values that we have. And if you wanted to do individual values, that would basically make it so that it would be the same on all your child requests. That's where you use these individual fields, the source and the destination. And you can add as many of these as you'd like by coming up here and saying, okay, I want to add another source field and then another destination field. Or if I want to do another repeating field, here's my repeating group, and then here's my individual field destination in the child process. Okay. And that's pretty much it. I mean, some of these, there's a lot of parameters, and it can be a little bit intimidating, and maybe we didn't explain some of these things to the best, but we can kind of circle back. I would say, when you think about this user list that you have to specify, this is our overall process list, right? The child process list. And basically what we're saying is as we launch another child process, our query is going to look for our parent process essentially. And when it finds it, there's going to be an originator associated with that. And that's what we're grabbing. We're grabbing that originator so that we then can resolve this swim lane in the child process and make sure that that person's still involved with the child processes. And I probably didn't explain that as clearly earlier as I was looking through my notes and trying to give the demonstration. But just wanted to make you all aware that that's how that works in Foundation. It does work significantly differently in Evolve, and we're going to get into that right now. So within the Evolve platform, and I'll switch over to that right now, we have a little bit of a different setup, if you will. There is no more SharePoint, so there is no process list to go look at. So we have to create our own list where we'd find that user ID. So what we're seeing here is probably the closest representation to or comparison to the Foundation environment because we're using a repeating group. So that's one of the big differences in Evolve is I have more options to launch child requests or child processes. I don't have to do it only from a repeating group in my form. I can do it from a reference data list outside the form or a group outside the form. Okay, and there's different pros and cons that we can talk a little bit about as to why you would use one over the other. But to keep this simple and show you like the most close to Foundation example in Evolve to get us started, it would be the repeating group because that's what we used in Foundation to launch our requests, okay? And we saw in part one an example in Evolve of launching requests from a repeating group in our form. Okay, so first things first, in Evolve, you have to specify your app because Evolve uses apps instead of form sites. So you have to specify that. And then you have to specify a library because within your app, you have a library for your forms and you have a library for your scripts and a library for your your data files and things like that. So you have to specify the library. And in our case, we want to launch a form, so it's going to be in the forms library. You could also have multiple forms libraries, depending on how you're setting up your environment. So you could pick which one you want. We just have the standard one forms library, so that's the one we have selected. And then you can specify the process name or the solution that you want to launch. In our case, we're launching a process launch demo, and it's dash child. What you might, I don't know if you guys are realizing this or not, but we don't have to specify the same app that our parent form is located in, right? I can change this app to be something else. So in Foundation, we were limited to have all the solutions in the same site, whereas in Evolve, I could launch a form from a different app. Don't know that that's the best practice, but it's an option that you have. Okay, so then getting into the rest of the parameters. So we have this single process. It's again the same as what we saw in Foundation, where it was asking us if we were doing a single process, right? We said no, we want to do multiple. It's the same thing here in Evolve. No, we want to do multiple. And then we choose how we resolve our swim lane, and this is where things start to get different. Right here, we're specifying a repeating group. And then we have, again, in our child process, that swim lane where we can basically take the originator from the parent and put that into this requester swim lane in the child so that the originator can still be involved with the child process because, again, that originator swim lane in the child process will be resolved to the system account because the system account is what goes out and does the launching in the background of all of our child processes, okay? Now, when we use a repeating group, again, we don't have that SharePoint list to go grab that originator. So we have to tell Evolve, go out to this reference data list because I have a list of all the people who could, be allowed to originate requests listed in this reference data list. So in my app right here, I'm specifying my app, and then I'm specifying the reference data list library, and then I'm specifying the reference data list. It says user solution, but that's really the name of your reference data list where all the users can be found. And then the value that I want to use to resolve this requester swim lane is user ID. It could be email, it could be full name. And I mentioned that there's pros and cons to each of those. Sometimes a username is going to have odd characters in it, like dashes or, there could be spaces. Sometimes full names use comma, right? It'll put your last name, comma, first name. And those kinds of characters can sometimes have an impact on resolving the swim lanes. Now, in Evolve, typically things are separated by semicolons, so it's not as big of a deal. In Foundation, things were separated by commas. So if you used a username and it was King, comma, Jason, for example, that would treat it as two users and it wouldn't get resolved appropriately because it wouldn't have my full name. From my perspective, and it's my personal opinion, I believe using email to resolve the swim lanes is generally the safest thing because there's no commas allowed in an email. There's no semicolons allowed in an email. It will basically work pretty much every time, and there should be no reason that it wouldn't. You'll get the full email address and it'll be able to resolve. Now, in our case, in our system, our user ID is first name dot last name, so it's a pretty safe bet. So I just use user ID in this case, but could use email, could use full name, just depends on the details surrounding those pieces of data. We also have to tell Evolve how to find this user ID. So basically what I'm saying is go look in my reference data list for user email, and when it's the same as the value in this field, this form field, grab that user ID. And this field in my form is actually capturing my email address using a current user control. So if I just jump to the form and we take a look at originator, right? RT originator. That's actually my email address. Um, if we look at the range, it's using that reference data list and it's showing my username, but it's the actual value behind the scenes is my user email. So when that field is equal to the email in the reference data list, and real quick, I will jump out and just show the reference data list just so that makes a little bit more sense. So I'm in my app, and then I'm going out to reference data list, which is in solutions. And then I'm looking for my reference data list here. And I don't see it on this view. So I think it's, yep, right here, process launch users. So if I just view that data, you can see that Steve is out here, I'm out here, and then our emails, and then our user IDs, right? So we can pull this information in and resolve the swim lane with the user ID like we're doing in the plugin. And I can find it by querying using the user email, okay? So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense as we're going through these parameters, okay? So as you can see, I'm getting user ID by querying user email using that field that has my email address in it. And that's how I'm finding my specific user ID. Okay, moving on. I also have to, again, specify the repeating group in my form where I'm going, where Evolve can go and find the data to launch each of my requests. I have resolved swim lane set to yes because I do want to resolve that requester swim lane with me as the originator. And then I have auto sync fields set to yes because any fields that I have that are named exactly the same and also have the same exact XPath in my parent and my child, that data will automatically get passed over. I don't have to do any special mapping here. And then the rest of what you're seeing is us mapping our repeating column to an individual field in the child process, right? And we kind of talked about that. And that's pretty much the same as it is in the foundation. So that is, in a nutshell, the big differences between foundation and evolve. But to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, we'll now look at the other options we have for launching child requests. So if we look at, I'll just go ahead and close that one down. If we look at this solution, it's a different version of our parent solution. We're using app group, okay? The app group option to launch child processes, okay? And you can see here we have single process selected. And again, I'm launching that process launch demo child. I'm specifying the swim lane. So in that child process, there's the requester swim lane. I do want to resolve it. And I want to resolve it by looking at this app group. So if I go and let me just cancel this and I'll open configuration, which is where we find groups. And I'll go to manage groups. And then I'm looking at my process launch group here. So if I go look at the users in that group, if I click here, I can see that the admin account is in there and I'm in there, right? So those are the two potential users it could find. What's going to happen when you use app group is the Evolve is going to launch a process for every person in that group. Now that may or may not be what you want to do, right? So it's more common to say, I want to launch a request for every row in this repeating table because I can control the data and I know I'm just launching one request for that set of data. Whereas in this example, we're going to be launching a request for every single person in that group. So, you know, I struggle to think of a use case, but you might think of a good use case for that. But ultimately, that's what you're doing. So every user that's listed in that group will get a new request just for them and assigned to them to do whatever work it is in that workflow that they need to do. And then from there, everything else is pretty much the same. You know, we have auto sync fields turned on, so any fields that are the same between the parent and the child will get synced over. And then you can set up your mapping for your other fields that you want to map to the child process. Okay, and then lastly, is our reference data option here. So in this version of our parent solution, where we have our form process launch plugin, we're using the reference data option to launch. So what we can see is that we now need to specify a reference data list. And it's going to work very similar to the app group. It's just that the users are going to be in that reference data list. And we saw that reference data list um, when I was using the repeating group. But again, if I have my single process parameter set to no, it's going to launch a process for every person in that repeating table or in that reference data table or reference data list. Now, I might have multiple users in that list, and there might be data in that list in addition to just my user ID and my email to kind of show me, okay, I'm responsible for this plant or I'm responsible for this sales org or so on, right? And it could launch, multiple for me because I'm responsible for multiple sales orgs or multiple plants or however you have your data set up. Um, so you can set it to no and launch multiple, or set it to yes and just launch a single. So it'll go and find that user if you just truly have users listed in there, and it'll launch your request for just that user. So here you're specifying the app, the library, which is usually going to be reference data list, and then what list you're using, and then what column you're going to use to resolve, again, that request or swim lane, and how you're going to find that user ID. So here you're seeing I'm querying user ID, right? So user ID is equal to originator. Now, in this case, I have the solution changed, and if we go look at that, I believe what we're going to find, if I've done it correctly, is in this particular version of the solution, I'm not even using a range. I'm going to have the user type in their actual user ID. So in this case, it would be CPS Azure / Jason.King. And then when I type that in my process launch, it's going to look for that user ID, as we can see right there in that query, in that field where I typed it in. Okay, so it's different than it was in the previous solution where I had a range and it was getting the email. Okay. Additional items, resolve swim lane. Obviously, we have it set to yes. We want to resolve that request or swim lane. We have auto sync set to yes. And then again, we get into the mapping, right, of our fields from our parent to our child. So those are the three ways in Evolve that you can launch a child process from your parent process. It's more flexible, gives you some more options to do that. And then the other thing to note is, again, even in Evolve, you still need your post-launch wait, and then in the child process, you'd have your pre-launch wait. So it's important to understand that and be aware that those things are still required. The one other thing I wanted to show with the process launch plugin in Evolve that's different is, again, we don't have that continue without waiting option. It's automatically set to false because it's just an improvement they've made in this new version where they know it needs to be it always needs to be set to false. There's never an option where it needs to be true. So why even make you fill it out? It's just automatically set. We do still have it in the wait. I couldn't recall for sure, and I knew I'd find out as soon as I tried to show everybody. But we do still have it in the wait, which, again, not really sure why you'd ever want that to be true. That's the whole purpose of a wait. But you do have the option, so be aware and make sure that it gets set to false. Otherwise, it won't do what you want it to do. Okay. So that was a little bit longer of a session, but we had a lot to get through to kind of get through all those parameters. Hopefully that cleared some things up, and you're kind of on a path now where you feel more comfortable using this plugin and hopefully have some success with it. In the next session, part 3, the conclusion of our series, we're going to talk about the things we need to do in our workflow, both in Foundation and in Evolve, to make sure that we get this form process launch successfully. Um, and then we'll kind of conclude things there. And at that point, you guys should all be prepared and able to go out and create some solutions that can launch other solutions and improve your overall landscape of your Automate platform and be more successful with using the tool. As always, if you need to get a hold of us or you want some assistance with some of these things, the bigger your solution, the more complicated it can get, and we're certainly well equipped to help you in any way you need. This is how you get in touch with us. Otherwise, we look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for your time today and listening. Hopefully it was helpful, and we'll talk again soon to conclude this series. Thank you very much and have a great day.